Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the statics in Java. In Java, static is a keyword, but this keyword can be applied to various different features. Okay. The static keyword, we can apply it to things like variables. Variables can be declared as static. When you declare the variable as outside the block, and if you apply the static keyword, then it is a static variable. And we can also declare the methods as static as well. In previous sessions, we talked about that methods can be instant, and you can also declare the method as static by giving the static keyword. And besides the methods, we can also apply the static keyword to the blocks. Whenever we have to create some sort of initialization block for the static variables, then we can use static blocks. And lastly, the static keyword can also be applied to the classes. But not every single class can be static. In order class to be declared as static, the class must be an inner class. In another word, only when you have the nested class, then the inner class can be declared as static. So those are the four members of statics that we can apply the static keyword to. And when you apply the static keyword to any of those, it means that static means that the particular member belongs to the class itself rather than to its object. Okay. Unlike the instances, instance variables, instance method, anything that are instance, they belong to the object. But if anything is static, it means the particular member belongs to the class itself. And since it belongs to the class itself, there can only be one copy of the static will be shared by all the objects of the class. Okay, all the objects of the class, they will have the same copy of the static member. Regardless of how many objects that you create from a class, the static will always have one copy that will be shared by all the objects. Unlike the instance where you can have multiple copies when you create multiple objects. For example, when if any variable or method was instance in a class, the more object that you create, the more copies of those instances will be created as well. Because each object, they will have separate copies of the instance. But as for the static, all the objects, they will have the same copy of the static. We are going to talk about the static variables. So when you apply the static keyword to the variables, it indicates that it is the common property of all the objects. Okay. If all the objects, they do have some common value for specific type of field, then the variable, we can declare it as static. Okay. And it gets memory only once in the class area at the time of the class loading, which means static will be set as soon as the class is loaded. Okay, and only one single copy of the variable will be shared by all the objects of the class, that is of the class loading. So as soon as the class is loaded, static is set, and that static, only one value of the static will be set for all the objects of that class, regardless of how many objects have been created from the class. Okay. And if changes are made to the static variables, all the other instances will see the effect of the change at the same time as well, because there's only one single copy of the variable that is shared by all the objects. So regarding from which object that you call static variable, since static variables also shared by all the objects, once you change it, it affects the value of all the objects. Okay, all the objects will see the effect of the change at the same time. And in order to determine what kind of variables can be static, we need to determine based on the objects. If it is common for all objects, then the variable can be static. If the value of the variable can be common for all the objects, that's the time that we make the variable to be static. For example, suppose that you are trying to create a class for the circle objects. Regardless of what the circle object it is, regardless of what the radius of that circle object it is, radius can be different from one circle to another circle, but the pi's value will be same for every single circle object. which means there's only one copy of this variable pi will be needed for all the objects of the circle. If one copy of the variable will be needed, then it is better to make it static. In order to save up more memory and resource, it's better to declare it as static. So once you make this variable pi to be static, once it's a static variable, it indicates that regardless of how many objects that you may create from the circle class, this pi's value will be same for all the objects. And if the variable is not static, it means the value of that variable could be different, can be different from object to another object, from one object to another object. So that's the difference between static variable and instance variables. Okay. To determine whether the variables should be static or instance, we determined it based on the number of copies that will be needed for that variable for all the objects of the class. If one copy of that variable will be enough for all the objects of class, then it should be static. Otherwise, it should be instance. We are going to talk about the static methods in Java. When we first talked about the methods, the custom methods, we stated that the custom methods can be either static or instance. And the instance methods, they are the methods that belong to the object, and in order to call them, you have to have an object. If you need to use the instance methods in other classes, in other places, first object has to be created, because instances you can call them through the object only. Okay. And static methods, they are the methods that can be called through the class name because they belong to the class. Okay. They belong to the class and all the objects share whatever the class has. So this static methods, it's shared by all the classes. It belongs to the class, which means static method, you can also call them through the object, but the preferred way to call the static method should be through the class name. So you don't even need an object to use or to call the static method. As long as you call it through the class name, you can call it at any time as long as the method is accessible. Okay. And static methods. There is another difference between static method and instance methods. The static methods, they only accept the static members. They accept the members that belong to the class, or they only accept the class members. And instance methods, they accept all the instance members as well as the static members. Because objects, they do share what the class has. But class cannot share what the object has. Therefore, the statics, they do not accept the instances. But instances, they belong to the object, and since the object can share what the class has, the instance methods, it can accept both static and non-static members. Okay? So, for example, suppose that here is the circle class, the custom class circle that I created here. In this circle class, we have instance variable radius because different circle objects, they could have different radius. And the variable pi, we also have a variable pi, but it is declared as static because pi's value is same for all the circle objects. And if you need to create a method, that can display the pi's value, in this case, the method can be static because in this method, I don't need to use any instance at all. Static method does not accept any non-static members. So in order to determine whether the method should be static or not, you can determine based on if the method needs to use any instance or not. If the method does not need to use any instances, then the method, you can declare it as static. And once the method is declared as static, then you can call the method through the class name. Okay. For example, this method, it only needed to use this variable, which is not instance. If it is not instance that the method that needs to use, then the method can be static. And once this method is static, the method, you can call it through the class name. Okay. And here is the little comparison between static methods and instance methods. Static methods, they cannot access instance methods and instance variables directly. But the instance methods, they can access the instance methods and instance variables directly. And the static methods, inside static method, we cannot use this keyword, okay? Because this keyword is used for calling the instances. And static method, it does not accept the instances. So therefore in static method, you cannot use the this keyword. And instance methods can also access static members and static variables directly. So any static members, you can call them in the instance method directly. But if it's the other way around, for the static method to call any instance members, it is not possible. This static method cannot directly call other instance members. Okay. So anytime when it comes to declaring a custom method, whether in order to decide should the method be static or not, this is the only question that needs to be answered. Does the method use any instance variables or instance methods? If the method needs to use any instance variables or instance method, then the method that you declare must be instance method. And if the method that you are creating does not need to use any instance variables or instance methods, then the method should be static. And when it's static, you can just call it through the class name later on if you need to use.